Have you ever overheard a sentence, just a few simple words, not meant for you, but it felt like your entire life had been waiting for someone to say exactly that? Not a hug. Not a grand gesture. Just the right words, at the right moment, for the right person who needed them most. Today's story is not about heroes or miracles. It's about something far more fragile, and far more powerful. A child who has never been asked. A father who has never truly heard. And a sentence so soft it almost didn't register. Until it cracked open a man who thought he'd locked his heart away for good. If you've ever believed that the smallest voices deserve to be heard first, like this video, stay with us until the end, because one sentence, spoken to a child who never answers, will bring a billionaire father to tears. Not because it was spoken to him, but because it was exactly what he should have said 10 years ago. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of soft, curated lighting designed not to interrupt, only to flatter. Linen-draped tables glowed under amber sconces. Every movement, every whisper, carried a kind of quiet reverence. This wasn't a place for celebration. It was a place for decisions, high-stakes ones. At a corner table by the window, Richard Dean sat with the stillness of a man used to controlling outcomes. 60, silver-haired, crisp in his tailored suit, he radiated the silent gravity of someone who'd long stopped explaining himself. He spoke with measured clarity to two men across the table, industry men, like him, with voices that didn't rise but sank, heavy with consequence. Next to him, barely moving, sat his 10-year-old son Leo. The boy's chair had been pulled up to the table like a formality. A nod to propriety. A gesture of inclusion that rang hollow in every way. Leo didn't speak. Not because he wasn't allowed, though in practice, no one ever addressed him, but because he didn't. He never had. Not a full word, not a sentence. His eyes floated, never anchored. His hands worked the hem of his shirt beneath the table, ringing, twisting, a silent rhythm known only to him. No one looked at him. No one made room for his silence. To Richard, Leo's presence was an inevitability tonight. The boy's mother was in Europe, and there was no staff at the estate he trusted with dinner. So Leo came along, an appendage to the evening, another thing Richard had to manage with efficiency. They were 20 minutes into business when she arrived. Mara Lynn moved like she was part of the room, present but unobtrusive. She wore her black apron low and loose, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms worn by work, not show. Her eyes scanned the table with practiced grace, the men's drinks, the untouched appetizer, the boy. Then she paused. No one noticed at first. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't address the group. In fact, she didn't say a single word to Richard or his guests. She simply stepped to the side of Leo's chair, crouched slightly, just enough so her face met his at eye level, and placed a small plate of warm bread before him. Then softly, so softly it might have been missed entirely, she leaned in and said, "You don't have to answer. I just wanted to ask you first." She said it like she meant it. Like she didn't expect anything. Like she'd said it 100 times before and had made peace with getting nothing back. Leo's fingers stopped moving. His eyes turned. Slowly. Not fully, but enough to meet hers. And then, he nodded. A tiny, nearly imperceptible nod. Mara smiled. Not a performative one, not for the table. Just for him. Then she stood and moved on. Not another word. No explanation. Richard's eyes had caught it mid-conversation. His words stumbled for a beat, just a beat, and then continued. But something was off. His fingers clutched the stem of his wine glass with just a little too much tension. No one else at the table seemed to notice. But Richard had. He had seen his son look up. He had seen his son nod. And most of all, he had heard a sentence that wasn't meant for him, but somehow felt like it was. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate either. Mara walked back toward the table with an ease that came from years of balancing more than plates. In her left hand, she carried a small dish, An unnecessary addition, really, but she had chosen it deliberately. Warm bread, soft butter, and a folded linen napkin. It wasn't much, but it gave her an excuse to return to the boy who hadn't moved since she left. She didn't look at Richard. Not this time. She didn't glance toward his business associates or check to see if anyone noticed. Her body angled slightly, shielding the boy from view, as if she were creating a moment that belonged to no one else. And then, she bent her knees, lowering herself so that her eyes were level with his. Not above him. Not looking down. Just beside him. Leo's hands had returned to twisting his shirt again, the fabric slightly damp from the constant friction. His eyes were downcast, somewhere between the table and his own lap. Mara didn't try to fix his posture. She didn't instruct him to look up. Instead, she placed the dish in front of him gently, careful not to slide it in with force. Her movements were slow, intentional, like she was asking permission with every gesture. Then, just above a whisper, she said the words. "You don't have to answer. I just wanted to ask you first." That was all. No question followed. No clarification. The sentence didn't reach the center of the table. It wasn't meant to. But Leo heard it. His hands paused. His fingers released the edge of his shirt, hovering mid-air like they were unsure of what to do now that they'd been noticed. His chest rose with a small breath, slight, but visible to someone watching closely. And then, he turned. Not fully. Just his head. His eyes met hers, briefly. A flicker of connection. Enough to mark it real. And he nodded. Just once. A tiny, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of agreement or compliance. It was something else, something that said "I heard you." Mara's expression didn't change. She didn't smile widely or gasp. She just nodded back, as if to say, "That's enough." Then she stood and walked away. No fanfare. No added attention. But something at the table had shifted. Richard, mid-sentence with his wine halfway to his mouth, froze. His jaw didn't drop. His voice didn't crack. But his eyes followed Mara as she walked away, and then flicked back to Leo, who was still looking down at the bread like it had just been handed to him by someone who saw him. For a man who had built empires by reading rooms, by sensing subtle shifts in negotiation dynamics, Richard felt suddenly, deeply off balance. What had she said? He wasn't sure. He hadn't caught the words. Only the tone. Gentle. Respectful. Personal. It hadn't been for him. That much was clear. It had been for Leo. And Leo had responded. Richard blinked slowly, then set the wine glass down without taking the sip. His fingers lingered on the stem longer than necessary. He didn't speak. Neither did Leo. But across that quiet table in a restaurant designed for power and discretion, something small and unspeakably human had happened, just beneath the surface. And it hung there, invisible to the others. But not to Richard. Not to the father who had just witnessed something he couldn't name, but also couldn't forget. Richard didn't move. Not right away. He stayed seated, one hand still resting lightly on the base of his wine glass, the other finger splayed on the edge of the table like he'd forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. Across from him, the conversation had resumed, figures and percentages exchanged in polished tones, but none of it reached him. His mind was caught somewhere in the space that had formed between Mara and Leo just moments earlier. It wasn't the words, not exactly. He hadn't even heard them clearly. But he'd seen something, felt something, stir in the quiet that followed. A nod. That was it. His son had nodded. And for the life of him, Richard couldn't remember the last time Leo had responded to anything, anyone, not like that. The boy had turned his head, made eye contact, and nodded. Not out of obedience. Not because he'd been told to. But because he wanted to. The image looped in Richard's mind with a strange sort of gravity. The weight of it grew. He lifted the wine glass again, meaning to sip, out of habit maybe, or just for something to do, but his hand didn't cooperate. The stem trembled between his fingers. Not wildly. Just enough that he noticed the ripple along the surface of the liquid inside. He set the glass down. His throat tightened. Across the table, one of the men laughed lightly at something the other had said, the kind of polite chuckle that belonged in a room like this. But to Richard, it rang hollow. Muffled. Out of sync with what was happening inside him. He turned his head slowly. Mara was walking away now, already moving toward another table, back into the rhythm of her shift. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. But Leo did. The boy's eyes followed her, quiet and steady, like a thread had been left dangling in the air between them and he wasn't ready to let go. Then, almost absently, Leo reached one finger out and began to trace a slow circle on the white tablecloth. One loop. Then another. No hurry. No purpose. Just motion. Richard watched the pattern take shape, one circle, then another, each one drawn with such delicate precision that it hurt to watch. He couldn't stay. Something inside him buckled, softly, but decisively. He pushed his chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape against the polished wood floor. No one stopped talking. No one acknowledged it. He stood, adjusted his jacket out of instinct, then stepped away from the table. Still no words. Still no explanation. His feet moved on their own, carrying him through the dining room with a strange detachment, like he was floating just above the ground. At the entrance, a hostess glanced up, offering a warm professional smile, until she saw his face. Her expression softened, and she turned politely away, giving him privacy. The door opened with a soft chime. Cool air met his skin. And that's when it hit. The pressure in his chest collapsed all at once. A weight invisible until now dropped fully onto him, and he staggered just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone else, but earth-shaking inside his own body. Tears welled before he could stop them. Not loud, not theatrical, just sudden. Uninvited. Real. They spilled over as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, hand gripping the doorframe like it might keep him from falling apart entirely. And for the first time in years, Richard Dean wept. Not because he understood what had just happened, but because something in him had shifted. Because something in that room had seen his son. Because a stranger had said something small and quiet and devastatingly precise. And it had cracked something open that he hadn't known was still breakable. Mara finished her shift with a kind of numb precision that came from years of working through noise, both the audible kind and the kind that pressed from within. She wiped tables, refilled glasses, and nodded politely at compliments she didn't really hear. But something had shifted. There was a silence sitting beneath her ribs that hadn't been there before. A silence that wasn't empty, but full. After the last table cleared, the floor manager, a square-shouldered man named Jeremy, motioned for her to come into the back office. Her stomach sank a little. It wasn't unusual to be called in after a shift. Sometimes it was scheduling. Sometimes it was a note from a guest, good or bad. But tonight, something about his expression made her brace for the latter. She ran through it in her head. Had she done anything wrong? Spoken out of turn? Touched a guest's chair? No, she'd only spoken to the boy. And even then, it had been barely a whisper. Inside the office, the overhead light buzzed faintly, casting the room in a too honest hue. Jeremy didn't sit. He pointed to the desk. "There's something here for you," he said. His voice was neutral, unreadable. Mara stepped closer. Lying there on the dark wood surface was a folded piece of cream stationery, thick, expensive, the kind that wasn't used for receipts or kitchen notes. Next to it, a black credit card. Her breath caught. She looked at Jeremy, confused. "It was left by Mr. Dean," he explained, nodding once. "He said it's for you. Only you." Mara picked up the paper carefully, unfolding it with slow fingers. The handwriting was deliberate. Not ornate, not rushed. Just steady. "You said what I should have said 10 years ago." Her throat tightened. Beneath the sentence, written in the same hand, was a second line. Join Leo's world. Not mine. No name. No number. Just that. And the card. The weight of the moment sat heavy in her hands. She looked down at the card again, recognizing it instantly. Black metal, pristine. A card that didn't come with a limit. But it wasn't the money that froze her. It was the invitation. Not to a job. Not to an opportunity. To a world. A world that someone like Richard Dean had never been able to enter. A world that his son lived in, alone. Until now. She didn't realize she was crying until the edge of the card blurred in her vision. No one else knew what had happened at that table. No one else had heard the sentence. But Richard had. And somehow, without fully understanding it, he knew it mattered. Knew she mattered. Knew that what was said wasn't just for Leo. It was something he had needed to say himself, years ago. But hadn't. Couldn't. And now, someone else had said it for him. She folded the note carefully, placed it back on the desk, and laid a hand over the card. For the first time in years, she felt the stillness of being seen. Not for what she could carry. Not for what she could serve. But for what she could say. And that, she realized, was an offering no salary had ever matched. The building wasn't large. In fact, it was intentionally modest, tucked between a family-owned bookstore and a dentist's office in a quiet part of town. No signage, no glossy photos of children smiling, no promotional material in the windows. Just a plain wooden door, painted a soft, unassuming blue. And on that door, in clean white lettering, a single sentence. You don't have to answer. I just wanted to ask you first. That was all. No names. No titles. No promises. Inside, the space felt more like a home than a clinic. Warm lights. Earth-toned walls. Shelves not with medical equipment, but with soft objects, pillows, textured toys, quiet books. No white coats. No clipboards. Just people, soft-voiced, patient, present. This was Ask First. A place co-founded by Richard and Mara, though their names were nowhere to be seen. That was by design. This space wasn't about them. It wasn't even about adults. It was about making room for those whose voices didn't come easily, or at all. Each room had its own quiet. Each one was shaped by the child who used it. And on every door, again, just that one line. No credentials. No labels. That morning, Leo arrived holding a folded piece of paper. No one asked what it was. No one asked anything. He was older now. Taller. Still quiet. But different. He walked down the hall past the first 5 doors, 5 rooms he had already entered, sat in, and begun to unfold himself inside. And today, he stopped at the 6th. Room 6 was already occupied. Inside sat a young girl, maybe 8. Small. Shoulders curved inward. She wore a pink sweatshirt too large for her frame, sleeves pulled down over her hands. Her eyes stayed fixed on a single spot on the carpet. Leo paused outside the door, reading the words again, though by now, he had them memorized. His fingers brushed them lightly once, as if to say thank you. Then he stepped inside. The girl didn't look up. But she didn't recoil either. Leo didn't speak. He didn't try to make her. Instead, he walked to the small round table in the center of the room and sat down. For a moment, he did nothing. Then, deliberately gently, he lifted his hand and tapped his fingers twice on the table's surface. Tap. Tap. A sound so soft it barely registered. The girl blinked. Her eyes moved. Slowly, cautiously. She looked at him. Not fully. Not with certainty. But she looked. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Once. That was it. No therapist would mark it as a breakthrough. No chart would show it as progress. But in this room, in this world, It was everything. Outside, through the paneled glass, Mara stood silently in the hallway watching. Not interfering. Just present. Beside her, Richard said nothing. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. They simply stood in the quiet, two adults who had spent most of their lives speaking over silence, now learning to respect it. The program had no curriculum. No expectations. Just invitations. It didn't try to pull words out of children. It waited for them to offer whatever they could, gestures, taps, glances, pauses, and treated those offerings like treasure. Leo's presence in that room was proof of something that couldn't be taught. Only shown. That to be heard, one must first be asked. And to be asked, gently, honestly, without pressure, was sometimes all it took to begin the long journey back to connection. Some words come too late. Others arrive just in time. There comes a point in life, especially as we grow older, when we stop rushing to be heard and start longing quietly to be understood. We begin to realize that the most meaningful moments aren't always loud, heroic, or life-changing in the obvious ways. Sometimes, they arrive softly. In a sentence. In a nod. In the way someone finally asks. In this story, a wealthy father spent years beside a son he could not reach. He provided the best clothes, the best food, the best schooling, but never once offered the one thing the boy needed most, the dignity of being spoken to like a person with a voice, even if that voice never came out loud. It took a waitress, someone with no power, no title, no script, to kneel beside that child and offer him a question. Not an order. Not an evaluation. Just a question. And not because she needed an answer, but because he deserved to be asked first. That moment changed everything. For those of us who have lived long enough, this story is a mirror. It reminds us of the people we once overlooked, children, spouses, aging parents, because we thought silence meant indifference, or stillness meant absence. It reminds us of the times we could have asked something gentle, but instead moved on. Of the moments we were too busy, too proud, or too afraid to speak. But perhaps most of all, it reminds us that it's not too late. Even now, we can be the person who asks. The one who shows up, not to fix or correct, but to witness. To honor the quiet dignity of someone who has never been asked before. We don't need wealth to do this. We don't need training. We just need the courage to slow down, lower our voices, and say, "You don't have to answer. I just wanted to ask you first." That one line, written on a door, spoken into a life, has the power to bridge decades of silence. And if we can say it to others, maybe, just maybe, someone will say it to us too. If you've ever believed that a quiet child doesn't need to be asked, remember this. Silence is not absence. It's the place where real voices begin, if we're patient enough to ask first. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And share with us. When was the last time you were asked first, rather than assumed? Who gave you that gift?